Welcome to the Future of Teamwork podcast. My name's Dane Groeneveld, CEO of HUDDL3 Group. And today I'm joined out of London by Geoff Mulgan. Geoff's a professor of collective intelligence, public policy and social innovation, an author of many books. He's done a lot of work in government across Europe and even in my home country, Australia. And I'm really excited to explore some of Geoff's work and insights on the world that we live in, particularly how it pertains to the future of teamwork. So welcome to the show, Geoff.
Hi there, good to be with you.
Geoff, perhaps for the benefit of our listeners, you could provide them with a whistle-stop tour of sort of what your story, your background, what's brought you to be doing all of this great work that you do.
Well, I've got a kind of slightly weird, messy background. I mean, I had many jobs, everything from cleaning and van driving to cooking. I've got a PhD in telecommunications. So I was at MIT in the early stages of the internet. And then much of my working life has been probably split about 50-50 between working top-down with governments. So UK, Australia, Singapore, many other countries. And cities as well, from Seoul to Barcelona. Mm-hmm. And then the other half working much more bottom up on creating new organizations, some public, some NGOs. I did a lot of work in commercial startup, and in my last job ran essentially a series of venture capital funds. And I guess my linking interest is, how do you make change happen? What's the reality of how you link imagination, creative ideas, and practical reality? And in recent years, more and more interested in the whole field of collective intelligence. What's the emerging science and practice of how we organize thought at large scale, whether within a company, a city, or indeed the whole world? And I'm convinced this is the great topic of the next 20 or 30 years, not just how we do AI well, which there's a vast amount of money and expertise going in, but if anything, I think is more important will be how we organize human intelligence at scale, which includes teams, of course.
Yeah, no, I love that, Geoff. And I got really excited as I continue sort of to become a student of teamwork and social innovation, collective intelligence, when I looked at some of the body of your work, some of your books, because it is, it's based in a lot of real science, real policy, but it's also very applicable. It's very accessible to the everyday man, which I've picked up a bit of a theme there. So, you talk about this linking thesis of how do you make change happen. And I know I was listening actually to your podcast with Mark Leonard, which I thought was brilliant. And you were talking about this era of crisis that we've lived through in the last 20 years and how generally a lot of people have been a little bit down. They haven't really been given a story of what the future could contain, and they've become almost concerned that their children are going to grow up in a world that is less enjoyable, less beneficial than what we're currently in. And that's kind of a sad statement, but you started to share some real practical insights from history, but also from existing projects on where we can be looking more into the future and creating in a small way, in an exploratory way, what we think the world should look like. So, perhaps you could touch on a little bit of the teams that you've seen doing some work in that regard, trying to project where we're going to drive better welfare, better well-being in our societies, in our communities.
So what you're referring to there is some recent work which I started really at the beginning of the pandemic on imagination, and that was prompted by these surveys, which, as you say, show large majorities now expecting their children to be worse off than them. This is the first time in 2 centuries that's been the case. There are kind of obvious reasons for that in a country like the US, where half the population haven't seen any gain in income for a generation. In my country, in the UK, average incomes have been falling now for the last 10 years. So we're in a period of retreat and reverse. So it's not surprising people are pessimistic, and then young people in particular seeing the prospect of climate disaster. And all of this has squeezed out the space for, I think, a more positive imagination. And I think in some ways has overshot. I think in some ways it's become unrealistic, because I think we do actually have more scope to remold the world, our welfare, our health, what have you. So maybe just to talk about one topic which I was working on a bit this morning, which very much links to business. And this is a question of collective mental health. We become more and more attuned, I think, in the last generation to the fact that individual mental health matters maybe as much as our physical health. We've seen lots of data on epidemics of anxiety and loneliness and depression, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, caused by lockdowns.
Yeah.
And then the question flows, well, what do you do about it? And in some ways, the answers are not the same as the answers for heart disease or broken limbs and all of those things. They involve the whole of society. In fact, employers often have a bigger role in relation to mental health than governments do, because they are interacting with hundreds of millions of people every day. So there's one part of that agenda takes you to what's a good employer look like, who really cares about the mental health of their staff. And about a couple of years ago, I wrote a thing for the World Economic Forum on what collective mental health might look like, how you'd measure it within companies, how you'd spot the problems, work on them, things like mental health first aiders and programs and for which there's very clear productivity arguments within business for doing that well and doing that better.
Yes.
And then a couple of months ago, we published a big global study on a systematic review on knowledge on population level mental health, looking much more at the formal research literature, what can be done in schools, what can be done in face-to-face therapy or online tools or mutual support or self-help. And we're now at a point, nowhere in the world has done this. This is in some ways a set of problems which in the past were thought to be just in the personal realm. They weren't the concern of governments or big businesses.
Yeah.
Now they clearly are on the agenda. And all over the world, we see experiment to try and do something about it. Your home country, Australia, is on the forefront of this, with some of the states having quite sophisticated strategies. Some of the Scandinavian countries are doing great stuff. Individual cities are doing really imaginative work. But what's exciting is that although we know the question, we don't really know the answers yet. And so we are in a period of discovery, but hopefully at the end of that might be the reality of significantly happier societies without the chronic problems we see around us, where sometimes a fifth, a third of the population really struggling with every day sort of getting, thriving and suffering in silence in a way. And these things are now becoming talked about, visible. And I think we've got the prospect of really doing something about it. So that's just one example where I guess a bit more of a positive imagination can connect to real world innovations and practice in the present, and can get beyond little projects to something which truly is systemic.
I really like that one, and mental wellness has been a big topic for us naturally through the pandemic, but we are seeing it in so many more spheres. One of my mentors the other day said, you hire an employee and a human shows up. And the reality is that human's going to show up, and they are living through various anxieties and depression, or their family members or community members might be. And that has a huge weight. That's a huge burden, not only on the organization, but on your customers, on your suppliers, on people that are just touching your business in small ways every day. So I think that's a really important one.
And just maybe put a little plug in about, so 20 years ago, when I worked in the UK government, we did, I think, the world's first ever serious policy landscape approach on happiness as a policy goal, a little bit ahead of its time. The UK then started measuring happiness about 12 years ago, one of the first countries to measure it alongside GDP. And then in 2010, we launched an organization called Action for Happiness, with the Dalai Lama as our patron, which tries to provide evidence-based advice to businesses or schools or families about what do you do about your own well-being, and trying to synthesize the best available science to help people get by, support each other. And in some ways, the demand from business has been extraordinary for that, again, for fairly obvious reasons. And, again, a bit of a generational shift. I think there was a previous generation of business leaders who thought, this is actually felt pretty uncomfortable talking about any of this stuff. But for the younger generation, exactly as you say, you employ a human being with all their complexities and walks through the door. And with an aging population, that's the other side of it.
Yes.
And I was very influenced by the extraordinary research, I guess, 10, 20 years ago, which started showing that loneliness, isolation, was equivalent to smoking 40 cigarettes a day in terms of its effect, not just on your mental health, but also on your physical health.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the little things I sometimes use with audiences, I ask them, do you think cold symptoms, we're in the winters, there's a lot of cold symptoms around, are they more common amongst old people who socialize a lot or socialize a little?
Yeah.
And everyone says, well, of course, it's going to be more common amongst people who socialize a lot because they're catching colds. But in fact, the opposite is the case, because being sociable is good for your immune system, is good for your health, helps you
Yeah.
resist, whereas being isolated makes you very vulnerable. So there's lots of counterintuitive insights, I think, coming out from this focus on well-being.
I think that's fascinating. When I actually lived in London, my mother was a nurse. She was working with an outfit called The Haven, and they did a lot of work with breast cancer patients. And in preparing those women for going into their treatments, they'd bring them into a social environment, and they'd do a lot of things like art and poetry and cooking. And they actually found that that directly impacted the results of their treatment, their chemo, their radio, whatever it was. So I think that's huge. And often I guess particularly here in the US, we fall foul of just going down more conventional medical pathways and not thinking about that happiness or that well-being, because that's where the dollars flow, which is interesting.
You've got some plants behind you. So one little example, which I remember being told about it by the then head of the Rockefeller Foundation. This again would be 20, 30 years ago in an old people's home. And my daughter's working in one at the moment. They got half the residents to look after plants and water them, and the other half didn't. And after 2 years, all of the first group was still alive, and nearly all of the second group were dead. That just sense of being responsible, of having something to care for, is really good for us as human beings. And in very few offices actually ask their employees to look after the plants like the ones I'm seeing behind you, and feel some sense of ownership for the environment, the space you're in. And so there's a lot of knowledge there which isn't really applied in our institutions about how you make people feel more human, more meaningful lives.
Which is big, because one of our other guests the other day said, never in history has an employer, a business, been held as accountable for the experience of their workers as is the case today. And that's not just the experience in the workplace, that's the experience of life. So I think businesses, if they really want to invest in good teams and healthy teams and teams that can innovate and be change tolerant, if not change champions, then I think it's important we start to capture all of these different methods and best practices for our teams.
Yeah. And in this paper I did for the World Economic Forum, I looked at, there's a sort of dark side and a light side of this, because we're in an era when businesses can gather vastly more data about the emotional state of their employees. They can look at, every Zoom and Teams meeting and analyze the facial expressions and the moods and the responses. And that can be used in quite manipulative ways. But my guess is over time, some of that will turn into standardized metrics for assessing businesses, how much they contribute to anxiety, well-being, etc. And I think we'll get quite sophisticated discussions, because this is where it gets really interesting. I don't think necessarily the best business is always the happiest one. There are many roles where you need a bit of stress, you need a bit of anxiety, you need a bit of tension to get the best out of people. Everyone being laid back and chilled, is quite pleasant, but maybe pretty useless if you're trying to really, get to the frontiers of technology or creativity or whatever else it may be. So getting more sophisticated, really debates about the kinds of tones and moods and emotions which are suitable for the very different needs of retail or manufacturing or R&D or finance, is a debate which is only just beginning. There's very little good research and writing on this. It tends to be much too generic, in my view, and not finely grained to the different needs of different tasks.
That's a big one. We had a guest come on the show, Eric Coriel, and he talked about the best teams that are really going to make an impact have to have some tension. They need to actually do some problem solving together. So to your point, you can't just be happy and relax. And you see it in sport as well. I remember my son, huge heart, he was 5 or 6 and they're playing soccer, and he's running around and he's got the ball and he's going to goal, and there's one defender and the defender falls over. And so instead of carrying on to kick the ball in the goal, he stops and he picks the defender up. And I was like, that's not the plan.
Yeah, yeah, that's a very nice example.
Yeah.
Um, and as you say, I mean, in all the best performing sports teams, and you get the same in music and other fields, people have to be able to be very mutually critical and very
Yes.
self-critical. And this actually came up in a team I'm working on, again, just a couple of hours ago. Universities have a slightly strange, ambivalent feeling about this. On the one hand, informal academia encourages critical peer review. The way science
Yes.
advances is by you put forward a theory and then your colleagues try and knock it down as brutally as they can. And that's how progress happens. But then in other areas of university life, there's a real anxiety about ever arguing or criticizing or raising uncomfortable things. So
Yeah.
one challenge is, how do we create team cultures where people feel easy saying very blunt, critical comments to each other? And
Yes.
I'm a professor, I've got a knighthood and all that. People are much too deferential to me. So I'm always having to persuade them, say, I actually want you to be brutally critical to me, because that'll be more useful to me than you
Yeah.
saying, you nodding your head blandly. But it's quite difficult constructing those team cultures, I think, in many fields.
It's really difficult. I know my personal challenge in life has always been that I go out of my way to create a supportive environment for my reports. So I'm diplomatic, I coach, but I don't want them to be diplomatic with me. I want them to hit me with as much noise as they have to for me to know where things are at. And that's not always a great leadership trait, because I'm kind of bimodal. I need to be able to show both.
And wisdom is knowing when, because, there may be a day
Yes.
when you're really struggling with other things and you don't want your reports to really give you a hard time that day. So we all have to, learn the empathy of knowing what's the right register for the right moment and the right person. And some people can cope with very brutal critique, others, crumble.
Yeah.
And it,
Yeah.
yeah.
I know you mentioned just now about the power balance of who holds the data, whether it's the corporation, whether it's the government. And I know, I think in one of the other conversations I heard you having in a podcast, you were talking about hoarding responsibility for innovation. We're seeing with, and I would assume with collective intelligence, more intelligence being gathered, innovation happening in the fringes. And often that means you are bringing PhDs into the room, you're bringing government ministers, but you're also bringing everyday members of the public or business owners together. Are there any projects that you've been working on, or anecdotal tips that you see that help bring people together and allow them to have a voice and to start sharing what they're seeing as they start to construct these imaginations of what they want to see happen in the future?
So, well, let's take the example of net zero, which is another one I, like many people, are very immersed in. How does the world get to a zero carbon or even net carbon economy? I just published
Yeah.
this week a sort of survey of some of the states of knowledge on net zero, part out of work we're doing with a group of governments. Now, in some ways, that's exactly like the problems of mental health, or in fact, any other field, that it stretches from issues on which pretty much everyone has an opinion and a
Yeah.
relevant knowledge. If you've gone vegan, you will have a different set of insights than someone who never has changed their diet, or if you decided to give up a car, maybe rather difficult in California, but there are
Yeah.
many parts of the world where large numbers of people have made the choice to radically change their lifestyle. And then at the other end of the spectrum, net zero depends on some very, very complex, sophisticated technical knowledge about how you transform manufacturing systems, or the details of, recycling metals and
Yeah.
plastics, and the trade-offs of carbon. And there it would be absolutely daft to try and, democratize everything, have everyone taking part in those discussions. So in almost every field of collective intelligence, the task is, how do you harvest the best of that very widely dispersed knowledge and
Yep.
experience, but how do you not sort of overshoot and fetishize that, so you ignore the fact that we're in a very complex societies with very complex divisions of labor, which require
Yes.
deep specialisms, and sometimes to give those specialisms enough freedom to get on with their work and solve problems. Now, both those kinds of knowledge, in my view, can be pooled and shared and collectivized. And in a way, the great the great insight of modern science was that science advances most by being as open as possible, by organized as a commons. And
Yeah.
indeed, you only get, the intellectual property protection of a patent if you share all the knowledge with everyone in your patent submission. So this was an extraordinary breakthrough, a few hundred years ago, to
Yeah.
realize that our collective wisdom depends on not hoarding knowledge, not trying to keep it, locked into one company or one person's brain.
Yes.
Going back to your question, there are therefore some fields like, well, care is a very good example, where so much depends on lived experience,
Yeah.
that nearly all the best policy making now is very much co-creation with the people who will be affected by the policy. But then other things like monetary policy, or as I say, the regulation of synthetic biology, you need deep, deep expertise to do it well.
Yeah.
So horses for courses a little bit is what collective intelligence tells us about.
Interesting. And that theme of co-creation, I heard you talk about learning by doing, starting small, not coming out and trying to roll out one big change, but letting maybe the specialists and the users or the people who are receiving the care or whatever it might be coming together to just trial. Are you seeing more evidence of public-private partnerships or trials, pilots within organizations when you're looking at some of these shifts?
Well, I mean, the whole software industry in a way shifted to some extent from 20, 30 years ago. There was all massive contracts and all designed actually in secret and on paper on screens before it was implemented, and then usually went horribly wrong once it was implemented, towards agile, iterative learning by doing methods. And I think that's was entirely good for the digital world, that shift. In principle, that's how, new kinds of childcare or elder care or whatever should be done.
Yeah.
But that isn't always the case. Sometimes people find a too nervous to do that. And one of my big issues is really how we embed that more in schooling as well.
Yes.
The other thing I've been working on this week is we launch a new, undergraduate degree in this autumn, linking engineering to social problem solving. Now, some of that you can learn like anything else in a classroom, and you can look at case studies and so on. But a lot of that has to be learnt by doing, by working on real life projects on, it could be solar power in a neighborhood of London or something like that. And it's by getting your hands dirty and by working in a team rather than individually, not just a team of other students, but with other businesses and governments. That's how you learn. And yet in schools, the typical school still, the vast majority of learning is individual, on your own, and is a sort of knowledge transfer from a teacher, which is then examined to you on your own, completely out of sync with the working world, which is much more learning by doing, much more team-based, much more collaborative. And it really depresses me sometimes how in the US and the UK and many other countries, how in a sense, the norms of schooling seem to be more and more out of sync with what we need
the real
in the
world.
world outside, and especially the world of work.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I know you talked about writing a paper for the World Economic Forum earlier, and I read their 2020 Future of Jobs report, which said by 25, such a huge skill shift towards problem solving versus some of the technical task-based roles that have been there in the past. And if that's where the world of work's going, the world of education, particularly early education, has to shift. Are there any good examples? I know I've seen one coding school. It's called O1 Talent out of France. And actually they've got a school now in London, and it's all about project-based, team-based collective learning. So you're doing these raids and tasks. It's not sit in an online virtual model. It's come and work together in different teams. Are you seeing much shift on the fringes for that type of education?
Well, I set up a network of schools doing exactly this, we call them studio schools.
Right.
And the idea was to go back to the idea of the Renaissance studio, the studios of Leonardo and others, where work and learning were integrated. You learned by working, you worked and learned. And we set up these schools for 13 to 18-year-olds.
Yep.
where most of the work was done through projects, usually working with businesses, learning the
Yep.
maths and English and so on through practical work. And they had then different industry links, one with space, one with construction. Our problem was our education minister was totally hostile to them. We had an
Yes.
education minister who's still there, who believes you should teach kids Latin and stuff like that in the old way,
Yep.
and did everything they could to crush these schools. And because they were part of the state system, it made it very, very hard for them.
Yeah.
Now, I'm still convinced that is the method of the future. For the teenagers, it's more motivating, more empowering than traditional classroom pedagogy. But there's an incredible inertia in the system. As you say, some of the, like the coding schools, there's quite a few in the UK, and you mentioned the one in Paris, almost by definition have started with a different method. You can
Yep.
only learn coding by doing it.
Yep.
There's no point learning it in theory, but they're very, very marginal. And in most school systems, the basic methods of pedagogy are pretty much what they were a generation, 2, 3 generations ago. And most use of ed tech has, if
Yep.
anything, been reinforcing that very traditional knowledge-based approach rather than project-based team learning.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
I'm not saying project-based team learning is everything, but it's part of education. To its
Yes.
credit, the OECD, which measures school performance around the world in the PISA rankings, does now also measure collaborative problem solving. And just before Christmas, I took part in an event with the 40 education ministers of the OECD talking about all of this. And they are actually, quite a lot of them, I think, some way ahead of their school systems in realizing the need for change.
Yeah. I read a great article once that talked about today's school system being looked at perhaps as unfavorably as slavery is now looked at, because, and this is a harsh view, but it was saying, the school system as we know it came about in the Industrial Revolution. And one of the big things was keeping kids occupied while parents were at work. And we haven't really shifted, whether it was the times that children are attending school and the way that they're learning. So that was a very dark, heavy view on education. Probably unfair for all the great work that a lot of educators do. But there is an argument that we're a little bit path dependent. We've got to be thinking, if the future, like you said, if the future is more problem solving or more about wellness, mental wellness, why aren't we talking about that in our schools? Why aren't we dealing with some of those realities that these young people are going to have to face when they become adults?
Yeah, so then when there is the containment theory of education, is literally they were containers to take the kids while the parents were at work. And then I think there's probably the correct view that mass education played a cultural role in teaching children discipline, turning up on time, all these things which are quite unnatural. They're not,
they are unnatural.
They're forced on a population. But in a sense, what we need now is an equivalent acculturation for the cultures of the mid-21st century, which are different from the late 19th century. And that's the change which hasn't really happened. And particularly in a world full of smart technologies, AI, robots, and so on, the human role changes then. It becomes even more important that we do the things that even ChatGPT can't do, which are more often going to be roles of team roles, or of care, or of compassion, or of problem solving, or of wisdom. We still don't have any computers which are even close to being very wise. And so in my view, that's exactly where, a forward-looking education system tries to think through what can we guess about the world of 20 or 30 years' time? And it's not that hard. And therefore, what will change in relation to jobs and skills and needs? Now, in my last role at Nesta, we did some big studies, including in the US and the UK, looking at huge data sets of current job demand, the skills being demanded in different jobs through analyzing adverts, and then using a mixture of AI and expert groups predicting growth and shrinkage of different skills over 10 or 20 years. And it might not be right, but at least there's an attempt at providing a forward look. And most forecasts, as you say, predict greater demand for these sort of collaboration, problem solving, creativity, all those sort of things. It's sectors like sports and education and care and health and often services likely to grow in numbers. over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So it kind of makes sense. You prepare kids for those areas of jobs growth. And a
Yeah.
project I'm just starting or restarting actually next week, we're doing with Bangladesh, is on exactly this. It's a country of 170 million people, a potential for automation to destroy huge numbers of jobs in textiles, furniture, other sectors.
Yeah.
But they're very smart and they're wanting to, think ahead to what will be the areas of growth in the future and how do they help their population prepare for the skills and the jobs of the future to do that now, not in 10 years' time. And in many ways, they're a lot more, I think, on the ball than many Western governments, which are probably still trying to solve the problems of today rather than thinking 10
Yes.
years into the future.
That's a really good example, the Bangladesh example. It raises two thoughts. The first thought, I'd once seen, and you've talked a lot about care today, I'd once seen an article in The Economist that said Northern Africa is a perfect place for us to be developing more nurses and institutions to look after our elderly, and it's better climate and they've got talent there, and we can it's a different way of reframing the problem of a shortage of healthcare workers in some larger urban centers of Europe. And that article it captured my attention because they were imagining a very different outcome that would take a lot of steps to get to, and whether it was right or wrong, it was just good to see that line of thought. And clearly Bangladesh is doing the same because they know with the heavy manufacturing production industry that they've got that there's a lot of uncertainty for their people if they don't give them a pathway forwards.
I mean, this is beginning to happen, this sort of new global geography on health services.
Yes.
I was in southern India in December, where cities like Bangalore have really concentrated on world-class health
Tourism.
for health tourists, exactly, and much lower cost than in California. Dubai is doing it quite quite well. And there's good at this, and Turkey does it in dentistry. This isn't so much for permanent care, because often people want to live near their kids. That's the one downside. The US is the exception, where old people go to Florida to be as far away from their kids as possible. I mean, most societies, people want to be reasonably close to their kids. But for particular operations and needs, I think we may well see this completely different geography of provision. And Bangalore, for example, has some of the world's most efficient hospitals by almost any metric. They're not just lower cost, but they're also higher quality. And if you can do both of those, you're onto something.
It is huge, and it's often seen it's easier to design greenfield for a new, more efficient new way of doing things than to change the existing infrastructure and way of doing things. I wonder how that, going back to education, will play out. Like, if you do start to see these spatial shifts, does that then create an opportunity to create a university hospital to be bringing people through into different auxiliary roles? Because a lot of the way we've done work historically has been driven by the qualifications, the certifications, what we expect. But if we really open up our minds, surely there's a way to create more inclusivity, to bring people into para roles in healthcare. We're seeing it, but I think we could still see a bigger shift in that space, and probably the same is true for more efficient, more environmentally friendly ways of manufacturing.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a big issue, going back to what we talked about mental health, but also net zero, where ideally it's quite hard to really train up very, very professional face-to-face therapists. But it's much easier to train up a lot of people to a lower level, but maybe supported by technology to help them with diagnostics and support and therapeutic method, just as we all need to train up every electrician, plumber, builder to have a much deeper knowledge of low carbon alternatives for retrofitting homes. So I think there's much more of a continuum from the very the professional with a 6-year medical degree, let's say, to the a parent just busking it with their kids, and there's a lot of spaces in between. We're still very stuck on a small number of options, like 3-year undergraduate degrees, rather than breaking them up, having micro-credentials, seeing the different kind of mixes, which might be more efficient at scale. And I think that will in turn create opportunities for other places to become education centers. At the moment, it's
Yes.
still the US and UK universities do very well in the global rankings. Your home country does
Yeah.
pretty well. But we're beginning to see a shift as some of the Chinese and Indian and South American universities are certainly going up the league tables. And I hope some will specialize in very different methods of learning rather than just copying the Harvards and
Yes.
Oxfords and Sydneys and so on, which is what most are still doing.
Yeah. And micro-credentialing, I think, is a huge part of the future of teams because it also allows businesses, not just learning institutions, to start taking more of a role in education, both providing that learning environment, creating some of the courses. I mean, you're seeing a lot more user-generated content in the learning environment now for how to do this task in this industry in this location. So I'm intrigued by how that can go in the right way rather than sending people on 6-week heavy theory-based courses and hoping they'll come back and implement a little bit of that.
Yeah, and as I say, a lot of my experience, I teach a lot on things like civil service colleges and government courses from China to the US and elsewhere. And I still think actually most people learn better with knowledge they apply quite quickly,
Yeah.
rather than even the month-long or 6-week course, which they may love as an experience. But the
Yes.
truth is, they don't remember much of it 6 months later if you haven't if you haven't applied it. So they're not all that efficient. Now, one other thing I wanted to ask you about this,
Yeah.
in the schools I mentioned, we tried creating methods of mutual appraisal. So as part of the assessment process, might be assessed on your exams or by teachers or by employers you were working with from 14 onwards, but also by your team. And
Yes.
to me, it's interesting in universities, this is now standard. Our graduate students, when they work on projects, they mutually assess each other. It's called IPAC, in quite a robust way. But it's a way which doesn't happen in many businesses at all.
It doesn't.
It's strange that these methods of anonymized assessment don't happen, but they're quite good because they do stop free riding. They are good pressure to make sure teams are genuinely mutually supportive, don't aren't lazy and relying on someone else to do all the hard work. So my question to you was going to be, are these going to become normal in the future, or what's the blockage there?
I love that concept. I don't think it's there now. I think it should be. I think it would be hugely impactful. You think about a sports team, you think about that academic environment that you shared, and you see the results. On a sports team, if my neighbor who's on the wing, steps inside and lets someone goes around him, I'm going to go and tell him, hey, I think you could have done this differently. Can you please do it next time for the sake of the team? In business, and again, Eric Coriel, who I mentioned earlier, he talks about this unwritten contract, which is I won't talk about what you're doing wrong if you don't talk about what I'm doing wrong, right? Which is sad, but it's so true.
Yeah.
And that's not just at a peer level, that's going up. You look at some of the big organizations and there's a lot of parables about, well, we don't talk about what's not going well because we don't want the boss to be made to look bad, which means that all of a sudden everything changes. So I think there's a lot of inertia in business. There's a lot of happy, glad talk around the need to improve, but not really having those tense, honest conversations that you touched on earlier.
Yeah. So one of the things I thought might be interesting for this podcast is what question of how you organize meetings. And in a sense, this has been a bit of an obsession for me for a few years. Partly in my last job, we used to host innumerable conferences and meetings and seminars and discussions. And at one point I asked my colleagues, okay, well, what's the science we use to design our meetings? And they didn't have much of an answer. So I then went to Stanford, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, asking them, okay, what science do you use for all the meetings you organize? None of them could answer that question at all. So I then did a sort of study on meeting design,
right?
And which I published as part of a book called Big Mind, but I also published separately. It was partly looking at business innovations. Amazon has a very peculiar approach to meetings with written papers read in silence. At the time, I think it was Yahoo did every meeting was 15 minutes and others do standing meetings and so on. They were slightly sort of random and fetishistic, but at least they were trying to rethink the meeting. And I sort of ended up concluding there were some quite basic principles of meeting design, partly to ensure you didn't get exactly the dynamics you described, where everyone edits out exactly the most useful information because they fear it will disrupt the
Yep.
hierarchy. Methods which allow the introverts to speak, because often the extroverts speak far too much, the introverts far too
Yep.
little. Often which stop anchoring, so the highest status person is really important. They don't speak first because that then inhibits communication. There were lots of other, fairly obvious ideas, but since publishing that, I'm still struck that the vast majority of businesses and business conferences and of parliaments and all sorts of institutions do meetings without any attention whatsoever to the science of meetings.
Yep.
And then more recently, we launched a new journal on collective intelligence a few months ago with Sage and ACM, who are two big academic publishers. And there's a wonderful now sort of substream of really rigorous research on team dynamics and meetings and what it differentiates, a team which really buzzes and interacts with each other. And you can measure this sort of bodily, how much people are, their eyes and their blood pressure, all these things are responding to each other. This is beginning to feed this science of how do you, construct, engineer meetings which are, on the one hand, better at solving problems, but also energizing, where people come out thinking, wow, that was great, rather than, oh God, that was so depressing, which is what so many people experience their meetings. And I have to say, in a university, most of the meetings are far too long and really badly.
I think that's a problem in every industry, in every business. Like you say, there are some that have got their little formula. But one of the things that I have seen through COVID, which helped, is the emergence of asynchronous meetings. We had Kian Gohar join us. He was former director of the X Prize, and he's really doing a lot of work on teams being able to, particularly virtually and remotely, be high performing. And that asynchronous meeting where you put some content out and you ask people in their own time, because some people digest in 15 seconds what others will do in 15 hours, to come back and make their statements, and then you convene for a meeting later. That's a hack rather than good meeting science, to your point. But we're starting to see some shifts. I still think it's about holding leaders accountable. I think leaders hold the power. They don't really want to change their ways of doing things because it disrupts the balance. And I think that's where we need to go in society and in industry, is asking leaders to be more accountable for trusting the people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, some of the COVID stuff, I think was very good. Just the fact you could have sort of essentially a multimedia meeting where comments in chat could be at a different pace, a different tone, responding to the verbal interactions, as well as much more use of visuals. And those together, I had to give lectures through the pandemic, and I found it much better having students respond in real time in chat than you could ever get in a lecture room where it would be happening.
They'd have to put their hand
up serially. So the collective brain was, I thought, much more dynamic during some of those online meetings than face-to-face ones. So we've just reverted to the previous norms. But as you say, most leaders, I think one of the reasons good meeting methods have not taken off is also actually another little bit of sort of science, which I think is intriguing here, is social network analysis in businesses. I don't know if you've discussed this at all, but again, quite a few years ago, we started doing these exercises where you take a whole field, like all the people working in, criminal justice or education in a city. You'd map them all and ask them, who's helpful to you? Who do you get information from? And you'd get this sort of real map of the networks which actually make stuff happen.
Yeah.
And often that bore no relationship to the hierarchies and the roles. And businesses often found this. And at the time, I thought, my God, it's obvious this is going to become mainstream because it gives you so much insight. But it hasn't become mainstream precisely because it is threatening to those leaders who are shown to be not leading, or maybe they're the barriers to the system thinking things through.
I'm intrigued by that in a big way. And I don't think it's just leaders, because we see in organizations, in societies, that there are entities. So it might be a big corporation that's the top customer in the chain. It may be a dominant player in a in a supplier of parts environment.
Mm.
But they also need to be more responsible, I think, in the future, for helping not only teams within businesses but teams across society
Yeah.
and the community. That kind of leads me to my last question for you. We hear a lot about Industry 4.0 right now, so really applying data, big data analytics, AI to existing business models and systems, which is what I largely see Industry 4.0 as. And then there's some great books out there talking about Industry 5.0, where we become more responsible for societal value. Businesses become more responsible for societal value over economic value. And it's more about shifting the focus on employees from a welfare standpoint to a well-being standpoint, which ties back to some of your opening comments on mental wellness. When you talk about, another world and imagination into the future, there aren't a lot of good stories, good scenarios that I'm seeing out there that talk about what that could be in 2040 or 2050. A lot of what I'm seeing is about narrow verticals. What are we doing in education, or what are we doing in environmental or carbon emissions? But is there anything out there that you're seeing that captures your attention that around this Industry 5.0, around how businesses are really taking more care for curating environments for their people, for their employees?
Well, okay, lots of issues in that. I mean, on the first of all, on Industry 4.0, I think what that means is different in different parts of the world.
Right.
And for me, what's really interesting, probably the biggest challenge for, let's say, a Californian view of things, is that often the systemic shifts to truly 4.0 healthcare, transport, or energy, where you really are making the most of data and intelligence embodied in physical things as well as in software and so on. That requires whole system shifts where you change not just the business models, but the regulation, the law, the behavior, all in tandem.
Right.
And certainly in China, that's very much how it's thought about. Whereas Western companies tend to think of just doing one part of that on its own, like maybe a driverless car,
Yeah.
rather than thinking in systems. And I think for the next 20, 30 years, it'll be fascinating in the great geopolitical struggle, whether these two how these two very different visions pan out. My bet is the more holistic one may win over the classic sort of Anglo-American capitalist model, but who knows? Time will tell. And then on the bigger sort of 5.0 question, in a way, there's two different sort of stories. If you survey the public of the world at the moment, they say, is remarkable majorities say, we want business to lead on solving social problems. But, and in one view, businesses will be held to account for not just their ecological impacts, but their health impacts, their social. My guess is, though, that's not quite a plausible route, because I don't think business as currently constituted, shareholder, publicly quoted companies can ever either have the skills or the structural capability to play many of those roles.
Right.
And what I suspect we will more see, and this is what's happened in previous periods of profound transition, is the emergence of plurality of different kinds of institutions. So alongside capitalist businesses, maybe different kinds of entities managing data, which may be trusts or mutuals or co-ops, different kinds of entities perhaps doing neighborhood energy or food or healthcare, rather than trying to, in a sense, fit this very standardized model of the essentially 20th century capitalist corporation and try and get it to do all these new tasks, which it wasn't designed to do and probably will never do very well. So I'm entirely in favor of asking businesses to be more accountable for their impacts, their externalities, as economists would say it.
Yeah.
Well, I think if you really look systemically and structurally, you shouldn't put all your eggs in that basket. You shouldn't expect too much from that. And instead, and perhaps this is a final thing to say, I've become obsessed with the need. I think the next 20 or 30 years, we need a lot of new institutional organizational design, different principles of organizational design.
Yeah.
The US, it's a generation or two since there were any big new public entities like a NAFTA or a DARPA or a Medicare. A bit the same in countries like mine. we've depended far too much on one, let's say, business ownership model. We've
Yep.
had slightly crazy alternatives like DAOs coming out of the
DAOs, yeah, I was going to ask about that.
but they're not based on any very good thinking or theory of what kind of organizational model works for what task.
Yep.
So if anyone's interested, back in the summer, I published a paper on what I call the new field of organizational architecture.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of foundations, mainly US ones now, very interested in this space and trying to think through both the principles and the practice of the new generations of institutions, some global ones, on the oceans or data, some at a city level, some on particular industry 4 or 5.0 issues like the management of energy. And I would love critique if anyone wants to read my paper and tell me what's wrong with it. But if I had to bet, it is that we will get, and this often happens, more of the answers will come from innovations in organizational form rather than just trying to tweak the old organizational forms to do the new tasks.
Yeah. I think that's a great point to end on, Geoff. I really appreciate the way you brought out there that, Industry 4.0 means different things in different worlds or different parts of the world. And the fact that you took that into a systemic way of looking at things, regulations, law, behaviors, and what's happening maybe out in the East. And then look at what that means for institutions in the future that help teams and communities become more effective. I think that allows me to go away and do a lot of research, certainly cover the paper. And I'm sure it encouraged our listeners to be thinking, further afield as to, what are today's problems that they're stuck solving, but what could they be thinking towards and who should they be connecting with to become more of a change agent in their own industry or in their own locality.
Yeah. And imagine it's 2025, you've got to create a new organization for a new task. DAOs, as I say, are creative and interesting, but they're completely daft because they've learned nothing from thousands of years of human experience with the organizations. So if we can have a bit of that creativity, but allied to a little bit of better theory and history and understanding, then we could really get some great new innovations.
Yeah, and that's exciting. That's, when we do get stuck in the negativity of whatever we've seen in social media or today's problems, I think it's always a really good exercise to kind of look out into the future and say, I'm grateful for all of these people and tools that I have available to me, and what could we do in the future? I think that's a great way to frame it.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks a lot for your time today, Geoff. I think it's remarkable how much your body of work is touching in the world, and it is very, very relevant to future of teamwork and to our listeners' interests, but to a lot of other spheres of life. So thanks for all that you do. And if anyone wants to find more on your body of work and services, what's the best way for them to be connecting with that material?
I mean, probably I have a website, geoffmulgan.com. I put some stuff still on Twitter at Geoff Mulgan. And I'm always keen to have critique and response. If you do read something, please feedback what you think's right or wrong with it. And all power to you. I'm pretty convinced the future is teamwork. And it's not just my colleagues show in business how the role of teams has grown. I'm in an engineering and science department now. The scale of the role of teams in science has completely transformed science in the last 50 years, where many papers are now written with 1,000 authors. One had 10,000 authors. This is a complete transformation of the teamification of science, which maybe you should do a program on that at one point.
I'm going to put it down. That's a great tip. Teamification of science. We are hoping to put a book together in the future, so I'll come back and bounce some ideas around with you on a good approach to that as well.
Great. Thank you, Dane.
Thanks, Geoff. Appreciate your time.